Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've been reading and authors that I've been interviewing. And today we are joined by Annie Reed. Annie Reed has written a fantastic nonfiction book titled The Impostor Heiress. The Impostor Heiress, this is a true story about a lady who has many names, but basically is known as Cassie Chadwick. She's back in the Gilded Age. She's a grifter. She's a con artist, a swindler. And this is her story that Annie has put together from us from voluminous research, over 5 years of research just to get this book out. It's amazing. And we find all about this woman who starts as a young girl up in Canada, where she's from, trying to run cons, trying to run forgeries on promissory notes to have people give her money. And, we hear about that. We hear how that first trial ends up. We hear all about her machination, the different aliases this woman has. She has so many aliases, including a clairvoyant, Madame de Vere, and we're back in the Gilded Age, that period from the 1880s, early 1900s, no internet, not much information you could find out for one person as she went from city to city, changing her ID here and there. It's a fantastic story about a lady who's not a very nice lady. Okay. She's not really a very nice lady. She swindles and she uses men to get money so she can do it. And the thing is, she's telling everybody that she is the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. Yes, Andrew Carnegie shows up in this book. She's not his illegitimate daughter, but she's telling everybody that. And it's just an amazing con that she ran on so many people. She'll tell us. Back then, she conned, that we know of, over $2 million. That's around $60 million today. That's that we know of. There are a lot of people who didn't come clean about all the money they loaned her. Oh, it's an amazing story. And I'm going to tell you what, this is a well-researched book, and I really, really enjoyed this. And you know what? I want to put this up here for everybody. There is The Impostor Heiress, okay, by Annie Reed. Is Annie's name there? There she is, Annie Reed, down there in the bottom. This is one you want to get. It's a great book. I think you'll really enjoy this. So let's go right to the interview with Annie Reed. Welcome, Annie, to Books and Looks.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're happy you're here. I really enjoyed this book. This is a real, fiction cannot imitate this. This is so good. It was unbelievable. When I read this book, I could not believe this. I kept thinking, are you sure this is not fiction? No, none of this is made up. This is all 100%. And we'll get into this. All your research, all your stuff. You do wonderful work on this. Really great stuff.
Thank you.
Now, before we get into the actual book, let's talk a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to college? Did you get 80 degrees? Did you take any writing classes?
Well, I grew up in Troy, Illinois, which is really it's more of a St. Louis town. A lot of people hear Illinois and assume Chicago, but we're on the other side of the state, just outside St. Louis. And I went to college at University of Illinois, and I got my history degree, and I got my law degree from the University of Notre Dame after that. Um, no creative writing classes. Had to take legal writing for to get my law degree, but that's really about it. I've always just liked writing.
Always like writing. Another lawyer, no longer being a lawyer. And I'm
A lot
assuming
of
you no
them.
longer are a lawyer. I'm assuming you've just given that up. Good.
Yep. Yes, I have.
Smart girl. Smart girl. Anyway, well, that's interesting because I was talking to one gentleman. He actually teaches a writing class for nonfiction writing, which I thought was pretty interesting.
That's so
But it's up in
fascinating.
Canada, so I don't know. Might be a little far to go, but that's I never knew they had a writing class for writing nonfiction. So that was
No,
interesting. Anyway, growing up, did you like history?
I loved it.
Did.
My dad was always a big history buff, and so he kind of really encouraged us to learn about history, and he was always talking to us about it. He made my sister and I memorize what day Pearl Harbor was in grade
Hmm.
school, and, like,
Okay.
really got a kick out of the fact that his kids knew the Pearl Harbor date and no other kids probably did. Um, so I've always just loved history. My favorite class in every grade level growing up was history.
Obviously, you had good teachers then.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. My high school teacher for history was just fantastic and really really just made me wanna read more. I remember
Mhm,
reading reading our textbook just in my spare time and then rereading it and,
mhm.
um, yeah, great teachers, good
Good,
instruction.
good. Did you take any history, major in college, or did you take minors in history? What were you doing there?
I majored in history,
Okay.
and it was really across the board. I didn't specialize in any area,
Mm,
just a generic history degree, a lot of Civil War classes just because there
mhm,
were a lot of Civil War classes and it was so fascinating, but no
mhm, yeah,
specific area
okay.
of
All
specialty.
right. Well, great. Well, now this book, which is about a lady by the name of Cassie Chadwick, um, you call her one of the greatest grifters of the Gilded Age. Now, some people are not familiar with that term, grifter. Why don't you define grifter for all of us?
It really is just another word for swindler or con artist. It's somebody who's taking your money, but they're using lies and they're getting you to give you their money. They're not stealing money from your house or holding you at gunpoint. It's they created this alternate reality to where you think you're giving them money for one reason, but really they're just gonna take it and leave.
Hmm. Okay. And then Gilded Age. What does that comprise? What years would you say that comprises?
Post Civil War through the early 1900s. So about 1865 through the early
Okay.
1900s.
The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum, a wonderful book, was on here a few weeks ago, the author. She was a fence, the largest organized crime lady in America, and she was have you heard of her?
Oh my gosh, yeah, I this book is on my to read list.
Okay.
I've read a lot about one of her little mentors, Sophie
Yeah.
Sophie, uh,
Mhm.
Sophie, yeah, Sophie Lyons.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so I remember reading about her as well as I was reading about
Okay.
Sophie Lyons.
But wonderful book, and I really recommend it, and I learned a lot, and it's interesting because she talks about this Gilded Age. You're talking about it, and, you know, as I think about it, was it easier, do you think, to be a con man or to run this stuff back in the Gilded Age than nowadays?
I think it was easier to do it in person. I
Mhm.
mean, as we all know, like, online swindling and
Yes.
scamming is just such a huge problem that I don't know that it was easier, but it was easier to do this kind of thing, to just, like,
Right,
walk into a town, take on a new identity, and, convince people that they should give you their money.
right. No one could check your background too easily.
Right.
It was yeah, it was fascinating, and she's a master of this. So now tell me, how did you discover Cassie Chadwick, and then what made you then wanna write about her?
Well, I was listening to this podcast. This was back in 2018, called Stuff You Missed in History Class, and they had a Cassie Chadwick episode. Now, I never had heard of her, and at the time, I was living in Ohio, and all of my in-laws were from Cleveland, and they had never heard of her. So I was just so intrigued, and the only book at that point, I just immediately ran out to buy a book about her so I could just read more. But the only one out at that point had been written in 1975, I wanna say, and it was really more historical fiction than just straight history. Uh, Especially, like, the first half of her life, so I really wanted to do it myself, and I felt like I had the skill set between law school and history, my history degree to do it.
And you also had the internet, which they didn't have back in 1975, which
No,
helps.
no, yeah, I know, I had access to all of the Cleveland Plain Dealer and Cleveland Leader archives, which was
Wow,
fantastic.
great. Well, now, Cassie Chadwick is not her real name. What is her real name, and where did she grow up?
She was born Elizabeth Bigley, and she was part of this really big family, and they lived in Eastwood, Ontario, which was just this really rural, small town. A lot of farmers, there was a sawmill there, but not a lot else, just rural Ontario.
Mhm. Well, her life seems to be dominated by switching, aliases, always going from one name to another name, back and forth, hither and yon. Uh, did that make it hard to research her?
It was madness. It was because there were so many different cities as well, and there were years that I couldn't account for her life, so I would look in Cleveland, Toledo, Erie, Youngstown, any city around that area, and like have to go through 8 to 10 different names and different spellings of those names because they weren't the best about spelling it exactly the same every place back then. I wasted so many hours just because I had to search every name. Um,
Wow.
it was crazy.
Really? Wow. And she, how many did she go by all totaled? How many did you find?
Well, I have a list right here. I
Okay.
wanna say it
Feel free to
was
read it off to us so we all know who she was.
these are the ones that I know that she used at some point. There were other articles that would say she used Johnson, she used this name or that name, but I never encountered them in my research, so I didn't include them, but
Okay.
she was Lydia DeVere, Marie LaRose, Maisie Bagley, Mrs. Scott, Florida Blythe, Cassie Hoover, Alice Pistato, and she used the last name Klingon sometimes.
And again, no Social Security, no national ID, no nothing. It's
No
just
social
go.
media to be
Nope.
sending her picture around and saying, "Hey,
No.
watch out for this lady." Yeah.
Wow. Wow, and she just went from place to place, hither and yon, and that's fascinating. Now, she began this, if I'm not mistaken, she began this at a pretty young age to start being a con or swindler, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, she did. It was 21. Um,
Okay,
yeah,
and that
she
was in
started
Canada?
yes, it was in her hometown, well, more the surrounding area because that's where all the money was, like the shops and banks, but started in her hometown telling people she was an heiress and that some relative had died and left her $18,000. And she carried these little cards around that said, "Miss Bigley, heiress to $18,000." So just, obviously that can't be wrong, right? Um, and she would also forge signatures on promissory notes. And she would use these plus this story that she built up that she does have all this money. And she would borrow money from banks and she would use them as payment in stores.
So she's like her own little business card she printed out or wrote out or
Yeah.
whatever it was. Yeah. Oh my god. So that's how it all started, huh? And she would go to nearby towns or like you said, a little not where she was from, but right outside a little bit, and no one knew who she was.
Th I wasn't sure about that. I was unsure whether I think some of them knew because it's
Okay.
still a pretty small area. It's just that, the store would be in Woodstock or the bank would be in Woodstock, so she'd go over there. But a lot of these signatures on these notes that she was forging would be neighboring farmers that everyone knew, "Okay, this guy's good for this money. So this isn't a risk to give her a loan on this note."
Mm. Now, was she I think she was eventually caught, wasn't she? And she was, prosecution against her?
Yes. Yeah, she tended to reach a little too big and stay a little too long when she was running these cons and run out of money. So eventually she runs out of money and gets arrested, and everyone's discovering that all these notes are forgeries. And she is prosecuted for forgery. Um, and this trial, a lot of people come to it. People tended to come to her trials because they were so fascinated by her. It was a packed room, and she pled not guilty by reason of insanity and actually was acquitted on those grounds.
Wow. And do we have any idea, did you were you able to look at court transcripts or anything from that? Or just we found out
No,
the yeah,
I got a
wow,
summary from like a newspaper at the time that talked about it, and that was it. I
okay.
did look.
Well, once she was found to be insane, did, uh did she leave town? Did she get out of Dodge, as they say, and start her travels then?
It was pretty soon after. Initially, she sent home kind of with her family, kind of like, young lady, you go home with your parents and think about what you've done kind of thing. Um, but I think it's within a couple of years that she goes to Cleveland to live with her sister, Alice.
So she's in her I guess she'd be in her maybe close to her mid-20s by that time when she starts
Yep.
setting
Yep.
out, okay. And the other thing I noticed is it seems like she concentrated again, we're talking the 80s or whatever,
Yeah.
90s, I'm not sure. She's concentrating around Lake Erie.
Yeah.
That's a big area. That's yeah, she never ventures too far from it, uh, on the whole. She does go to New York now and then, but on the whole, her cons are all done around Lake Erie, and no one can figure out this is the same lady.
Especially early on, I mean, I discovered this as I was just, like, kinda mapping out where she is at what point, trying to fill in some gaps, and it looks like I mean, she sometimes she goes, to a town in Ohio or something like that that's not right on the lake. But a lot of the times she's hitting places that are right on the lake. And I mean, there's all these railroads that are just going all the way around, and she can just kind of hop on the railroad and go to the next stop.
Mhm. Do you think she ended up in Cleveland because it was such a large town as opposed to another town, or why do you think the Cleveland was the final resting spot for most of her work?
I think initially she goes because her sister is there, and her sister is gonna be someone she can stay with because she doesn't have a job. She's just kind of going there initially. And she just keeps coming back to Cleveland. I think you're right. It's a huge place, and at this time it's just growing exponentially because of all the iron mills that are popping up. It's a lot of jobs, it's a lot of wealth, and the city is just exploding. And so I think, yeah, it's a big city and there's a lot going on, and it's easy to kind of be different people.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Well, now she goes to Cleveland because her sister's there. I some point in time, and I wanna get into this, who is tell me about Madame de Vere. That part of her life really where was that at? Where was she Madame de Vere?
And that was Toledo. So she moves to Toledo sometime around 1887. And she actually she takes three names in Toledo. The most well known is Madame Lydia de Vere, and she is a clairvoyant. Um, and this is something that she's very good at. Cassie is a very manipulative person, and she has a lot of good instincts about people. So somebody walks into a room and she can amaze them by telling them things about themselves that they never told her because she's reading them, and she's just very good at that. Um, so she's running this successful clairvoyant business. She's also calling herself Mrs. Hoover, and she's saying she had this husband who was a doctor and they're separated, but she still has his last name. And then at some point, she uses the name Florida Blythe as kind of another personality to perpetuate these forged notes that she's eventually forging
Mhm. Mhm.
with
Yeah.
somebody.
And that Gilded Age era was one where a lot of people, were believing in the clairvoyance, and, so this was not unusual to have. By the way, you ever gone to a clairvoyant yourself?
No.
No,
Not my
neither have I.
thing.
No,
No.
no. I went to the Reading Fair where they did that thing. We can guess your weight within 20 pounds. They always did,
Oh, yeah.
and I never got the prize. But it's fascinating. I've never been to that, but there are a lot of people who are into that. They're into the tarot cards, or into this, the tea leaves, boom, 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 boom. But the clairvoyant was something that a lot of people believed in. I mean, they really thought you could communicate with spirits and everything else back then. And again, she took advantage of that. She was very good at that.
It was something that grew up after the Civil War because there were so many people knew people who had died, and they were just desperate to make contact, and then it kinda just grew wild from there. It's very interesting if you read about the history of clairvoyance and the spirit world in the US.
Oh, I never really put those 2 together, but that does make sense because so many people fought in the Civil War, and we had no idea where they fell, you know? You can write home letters many times, you had no idea where they're at, so wow. I can understand a lot of parents or loved ones, "Hey, I can find them for you." Okay, great. One of the things now let's early on, we're not giving anything away, but early on, Cassie Chadwick, okay, goes to New York with a lawyer and goes to the home of Andrew Carnegie and goes in the house and is there for 20 minutes. What went on? How does this happen?
I would love to know. I really don't. I read a guess somewhere, and I kinda thought this was as good a guess as any, that maybe she was pretending like, some servant was applying to live in her house or to work in her house, and that they had listed Carnegie's house as a reference, and she was checking up on them. But that was a guess. It wasn't in the
Yeah,
actual sources that I was reading about
okay.
this
Wow.
instance, so nobody knows what she did while she was in there.
And apparently, again, if I'm reading between the lines, like, she comes out of the house with a signature on something, allegedly Carnegie's signature.
Yes.
Who
Yes.
knows? I'm wondering if one of the servants just signed it. I don't know. Did she sign it? Did a servant sign it? I don't have any that's a fascinating way to hook us, though. That's a great hook to get us started in this book, though, Annie. I really, really, really enjoyed that. Well, we talk about Andrew Carnegie fans because I'll tell you what, she kept telling people that she was Andrew Carnegie's daughter. Is that the story?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Apparently, Andrew was a little wild in his younger ages. Hmm? But not that wild with anybody with Cassie.
He got married late and was definitely very, very flirtatious. He liked dating basically for a long time. So I think there was this, he had this reputation as being kind of a ladies' man, a bit of a charmer, but he also just was not tied down for a long time. So I think there's space in there for something like that to have happened.
Right, right. Well, now here's what I again, another great part of this book is you'll do a chapter on Annie. Excuse me. I'll start that over again, son. Oh no. One of the things I really like about this book is you do a chapter on Cassie Chadwick, and then you put a little chapter in about Andrew Carnegie. Tell us a little bit about Andrew. Again, we all know he was a wealthy man, but we don't know the whole story. It's sort of a rags to riches, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He came to this country with his family in 1848, and they were very poor. Um, and came to Pittsburgh, and really it was the situation where like everyone in the house was working to try to put money on the or get money in the house and put food on the table. And he was very ambitious and he was really smart and he was very hardworking. So he started working as a telegraph messenger in Pittsburgh, and he would he would memorize the names and faces and addresses of all the important businessmen in the city so that he could do his routes faster than the other telegraph messengers, and he knew everybody and everybody knew that he knew them. So he was very good at networking. He was fantastic at networking. And so he just keeps working his way up. His bosses notice the amount of work he's putting in, and he makes sure that they notice. And he keeps getting promotions until he has enough money to start investing. And he starts investing in iron and bridges, and eventually he invests in steel, and that's where he makes huge amounts of money. He's called the Steel King. Carnegie Steel becomes like the biggest business in the country, probably in the world. He's just wildly successful, and he really came from nothing. He educated himself. Just it really was a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of a story.
Yeah. Anyway, Cassie, now we call her Cassie Chadwick, she's telling everybody she is his illegitimate daughter. And has anybody else tried to pull that con on him? Did we know of? Or was she the only one?
Not on Carnegie. I mean, I've read there are other people who will pretend to be like somehow related to a rich person who everyone knows they're rich, but nothing like this, and certainly nothing this on this big of a scale. This was just unprecedented.
Yeah. And people just she would go in with well, tell us, how would she get money from this? How was her con to get the money? Because she apparently had something, quote, signed by Andrew Carnegie, but then how did she use that?
She had a lot of things signed by Andrew Carnegie. Um, really, she was signing them. So it was this kind of two-pronged, like, she would run the same swindle over and over again. You have the story, right? I'm really rich because I'm Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. So, of course, I have this trust that gives me a ton of money twice a year, and he gives me money all the time. But because I'm illegitimate and he doesn't want to jeopardize his reputation, sometimes I run out of cash, even though I'm super rich. There's always a story like that. And that's her story with Carnegie. So she forges all of these. She forges notes. She forges a trust agreement um, with Carnegie's signature and presents them, especially the notes, to different people as proof and say, hey, look, Carnegie signed this. Sometimes she'll use them as collateral, but more often than not, she's just showing them as kind of proof that she is what she is. One of the most successful things that she does is that she writes out a note for $7 million from Carnegie to her. I think it was $7 million. Um, she writes out a note from Carnegie to herself for several $1 million, and she writes out this trust agreement that's bestowing around $10 million on herself by Carnegie. She gives it to Erie Reynolds, who's this banker and family friend. He puts it in a vault and writes this receipt saying, I have these securities holding them for Cassie Chadwick and they're worth all this money. Gives it to her so she can show people this receipt. And that's huge. It gets her a lot of money.
But that she never obviously she never get any money from Carnegie, and is anybody ever calling her on it? I mean, that's the thing.
Not really. There's a couple times she gets debts pulled in sometimes. So, but basically what she's doing is she's just borrowing money from everybody and she's trying to pay one loan with another loan and keeps doing this for a long time. Um, and nobody really questions the Carnegie thing that I read. There were people that would call in debts and she usually tried to put people off and say, give all these reasons why she needed more time to pay. But sometimes people would call in debts and she would have to figure out how to pay them before she wanted to. But nobody was really questioning the Carnegie story.
Wow, that's even back then. That's fascinating. I mean, it's wow, and especially when they had the banker. You say he put the stuff in a vault, and no one could even check to see if that would be what he really had.
No. People would ask to see it after they had loaned her money, and, there's one man who said, "Oh, I wanna take a look at it." And Reynolds would say, "If she says no, then you can't look at it." And she would say, "No, you can't look at it." It was wild.
One thing she seemed to be, in addition to being a clairvoyant, she also seemed to be a heck of a good actress. She could really, turn on the charm or the waterworks, as the case may be, as needed, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, she definitely could. A lot of tears, a lot of charm, and there was a lot of acting in the vein of, "I don't know anything about my finances, and it's all it's too complicated for me to understand, so I'll sign whatever you say." She just very much pretended to be this foolish, kinda ditzy woman who just had no idea how to handle her finances, when actually she was manipulating everybody, and she was writing all these complicated documents, and, she was a fantastic actress.
Yeah. Wow. Well, she eventually ends up I don't know how many husbands she had, legitimate husbands or just pretend husbands, I don't know. But she eventually ends up with a Dr. Chadwick. Tell us a little bit about him. What's his place in this?
Well, Leroy Chadwick, he was a doctor, as you said, from this wealthy Cleveland family. They had their mansion that was on Euclid Avenue. And Euclid Avenue was also known as Millionaires Row back then. It was just a street full of mansions. Everybody rich and important in Cleveland lived on Euclid Avenue. So that was a big deal for her when she was dating him, that she knew he was a big deal and that he came from some wealth if he had a house there. Um, as for his personality, he struck me as pretty he's kind of aloof and a little bit flighty, I guess. Um, and Yeah, I mean, intelligent. He was a doctor and he was a practicing doctor, but just maybe didn't have the most practical head on his shoulders.
Well, how did she pick on him? How did she find him out? I mean, that's because he has a daughter, if I'm not mistaken, also from a
Yes, he
prior
was a
marriage. Yeah.
yes, he was a widower. Um, I don't know how they met. I would love to know how they met. The most specific thing that I could get was that at some point they encountered each other and he had rheumatism and he was complaining about that and she suggested massage and he followed through and it worked really well. But that's really the earliest story about them encountering each other that I could find that was reliable.
Hmm. So he lives on Euclid Avenue, and I'm told that there are 2 ends of Euclid Avenue even. The further up you go, the wealthier he gets, okay? But he's somewhere on Euclid, and how long does it take for her, I should say, become Mrs. Chadwick?
It's not very long. I mean, again, I don't know precisely when they met, but I they hurried up getting married. Believe it was January of just going off of my memory, January of 1897. She had been paroled in from prison in 1893. So they met sometime in 1896, 1895, something like that, I think.
Okay. Why was she in prison that time?
That was from Toledo with that when she was having all those notes forged and um borrowing money based on forgeries.
How many times did they before the very final one, how many times did she get, prosecuted, and did she have to go to prison very often?
So before she was Cassie Chadwick and before the
Mm,
Carnegie con, she was arrested twice and tried twice, both times for forgery. The first time she was acquitted, we talked about that, the, insanity defense. The second time was in Toledo. Excuse me. The second time was in Toledo, and she was found guilty, and she had to serve a prison term. I wanna say it was 3 years. She was what's the word? She was sentenced to 9 years, but was paroled after 3.
okay. Wow, so she did spend some time in prison then,
She
and then
did.
from
She
then
just
Toledo she was back to Cleveland, and now she's there, and somehow she meets Dr. Chadwick, who is now a widower, and they get married, and away they go, and,
Yes.
he's not uber rich like the other end, which I think isn't Rockefeller up at the other end of,
Yes.
Euclid Avenue?
Yep. It's
Okay.
Rockefeller's side of the street.
Okay, okay. He's not uber rich like that, but he's pretty wealthy, and off they go. Uh, don't they go on a honeymoon over to Europe, if I'm not mistaken?
They travel to Europe a lot. I feel like it's for a while, it's like every spring or summer they go,
Mhm.
sometimes multiple times a summer.
She felt she had to fit in also. That's another big thing. She felt that that was a big something she had to do.
Yes. And that was where her clairvoyant skills and her acting came in because she didn't just have to fit in, she had to pretend that she belonged and that she was always this, rich socialite who'd been bred to be at these balls and, you know, making small talk in the drawing room. So she was just really good at thinking on her feet because she could pass it off.
So everybody has an idea. How much money did she end up swindling? Do you have a final figure on that?
I don't have okay, so it was almost certainly much more than what we know, right? There were so many men in banks that would just kind of take their monies and just kind of faded into the shadows. It was so embarrassing to be linked with her that it wasn't worth the the bad publicity. I mean, these guys who had given her money were getting just eviscerated in the press. People were laughing at them, and so there were a lot that just kinda didn't say anything. The money or the number that I came up with when I was adding things up, it was around 2,000,000 back then, which would be around 50 I think it was 58,000,000 today.
58 million nowadays. Wow. What'd she do with all that money?
She spent a lot of it some of it went to repaying old debts because
Mhm.
she had this whole, robbing Peter to pay Paul kind of
Right.
system going, um, but a lot of it went to things that she liked. She, loved decorating her house and redecorating her house, and so a lot of it went into artwork and sculptures and clocks and dinnerware and just anything that you could decorate a house with, she would buy multiple of those things. When they went through her house to, value things for bankruptcy, they found, like, rugs that had never been used, boxes of dishes that had never been opened. She just bought things wherever she went. And she also bought clothes for herself. She loved furs and gowns and hats. Hats were a big thing in the Gilded Age. And one thing that she spent a ton of money on was jewels, especially diamonds. One of her nicknames was the Duchess of Diamonds because she bought big diamonds. She would buy a tray full of diamonds. She loved diamonds.
And she would just scatter them around the houses, I think, at times.
She definitely there was a time when she was trying to con these guys in Pittsburgh, and she rented this nice hotel room, and she just scattered all these jewels and diamonds everywhere, kinda to look like she's just messy, and "I have so many of them, I might lose one in this crazy hotel room," like, yes, they
And no one thinks to say, "Why would you bring this and why would you lay them out?" Put them.
why would you lay it yeah, no, no, it was all part of the picture she was painting.
We can laugh now, but there wasn't a lot of laughter back then, I'll tell you that much. As a matter of fact, she almost got caught on the diamonds, because of failure to pay tax, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. She did a lot of, jewel smuggling, which sounds a lot more exciting than it is. In her case, she was just not declaring jewels that she was bringing back into the country from her European vacations, and she would come in and kinda hide them a little bit, like, in the things that she was bringing in, like vases and baggage, and she would hide them and not declare them and then just not pay any of the duties on them. So she was just basically stealing money from the federal government by not paying her duties. Um, and in 1902, this all caught up with her. They were the government was pretty aware of what was going on. It was happening on a large scale, and they had received a tip about one of the necklaces. And so one of the Treasury agents caught up with her at this hotel in New York and demanded this necklace and said she was going to be prosecuted for it. So she had to give up the necklace, but she hired a bunch of lawyers and got all of her friends in Cleveland to write these notes saying to the Treasury Department saying, I've seen this necklace on her before, so she totally has had it in the past. And she's very, honorable and she has all this integrity and she would never smuggle anything into the country. And she got out of it. They had to return the necklace and she, kept on with her life.
And I think the poor treasury agent got fired, didn't he?
He did. It was like a month later. He kind of had this history of badgering people, and she was one of the last cases that he had that he, went all in for and was really very aggressive with her. And there were enough complaints after that. And they were like, okay, you're fired.
Gotta go. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, one of the other things that's interesting is, and being a lawyer, as I'm a lawyer, she hired a lot of lawyers, didn't she?
she did.
Did she pay them all, I'm wondering? That's the thing, I don't know.
There's a lot of retainers. I mean, she was paying these retainers, right? And that was part of the reason why one of her dupes later got very upset that she's paying all these lawyers and he knows that that's a different retainer for each one. Um, and that it would be less money if she could just have one lawyer, but it was strategic. She didn't want anyone to know how much money she had borrowed. So she kind of had to divide so none of the lawyers were aware of how big her obligations were. And a lot of them, she was getting them to find other rich guys for her to borrow from. So she would use them as a go between. So that was another reason to have a ton of them.
Yeah. Just amazes me. It just amazes me. Like I said, this is no dumb woman. She is sharp as a tack, and, it's amazing that she ever got caught. I mean, it's not amazing, but it is amazing as well as she had this con down. She could go hither and yon. And, one of the things, we talked about Dr. Chadwick, but, a lot of the times he was married to her. Like you said, they were in Europe all the time. He got ill. He spent a lot of time in Europe. Did he ever practice medicine?
It did not seem to me of like he was doing a lot of medicine when they were married.
Yeah.
um, he was very sickly, so he was always falling sick. So he would spend like there was a year and a half that he was just in Europe by himself because he had fallen ill. And anytime he moved from here to there, he would fall back into sickness and then he just stayed for a while.
Yeah. Wow. Do you think he knew she was a grifter?
I don't know. Personally, I think that he did not know that she was fooling everybody, but that he knew that she was posing as Carnegie's daughter. I think he probably thought that she was Carnegie's daughter. Um, there's no he never confessed to anything. Like would even deny things that were obviously demonstrably false. Like, I didn't know that she was borrowing money. I don't know anything about her finances. Well, he went with her a couple times to borrow money, and he was signing these notes to try to help her out when she was flailing at the end. He was very well aware of the fact that she was borrowing large amounts of money. And he was most likely well aware that she was going as Carnegie's daughter. His really good friend, Erie Reynolds, who got very screwed over by this whole thing, said that he was sure that he knew that Cassie had told Erie this Carnegie story while in the same room with Leroy. Um, so he really did not buy that Leroy was as clueless as he said he was, and I don't
Mm,
think he was either.
mm. Do you think she ever loved him?
It is hard to know. I have to tell you, after researching Cassie Chadwick for, like, 5 years, it's hard to know if I ever read a sentence of hers that was true. She was just such a liar. I mean, like, she was a liar. She was someone who was always putting on a mask. Uh, so I know that she was very sad about the fact that he ended up getting indicted, um, and that he lost his house. The family home ended up getting sold in bankruptcy. Um, and when she saw him, she did a lot of crying and a lot of sobbing, and it seemed very sad. But she also used tears a lot of the time strategically, and she could turn on the waterworks when she wanted to. I
Okay,
think she probably cared for him on some level, but I don't know about love.
there's one person she did love. I think that was Amiel. Tell us
Yeah,
who is Amiel?
he is her son, um, and she gave birth to him sometime around 1886. It's hard to know. I really tried hard to find solid information about Emil, um, and I couldn't find any birth certificate or anything like that, but he was born sometime around 1886. Don't know who his father was, at all. Tried really hard to figure that out, and I could not. Um, but she had him and it was out of wedlock, and she really just loved him so much. She did. She just adored him. She was always very affectionate with him, and I think she really worked to distance him from all of her fraud and illegal doings. So much so that he wanted to help her more when he was older and everything fell apart, but she really didn't give him a whole lot of jobs to do because she loved him so much and didn't want
Caught up
him
in
to.
everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm, yeah. Now, one name we have to talk about is a guy by the name of Charles Beckwith, who I felt so badly for. Tell us who is Charles Beckwith in the story, please.
Charles Beckwith was a banker from Oberlin, Ohio. Oberlin was this college town, outside of Cleveland, and he was elderly, he was a president of a bank, the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, and he was really intelligent, he had this, career that he had built up this reputation in the community that he had like a fortune and he was really smart and he was very shrewd, but he was also pretty ambitious. And that was what Cassie used to get him. She basically went to Oberlin one day and started borrowing money from the bank. And after that, she would borrow money from him personally. So he was someone who would do these private loans on the side just to earn some extra cash. And pretty soon, she told him that she was Carnegie's illegitimate daughter and said, I have this trust that this other bank administers, but pretty soon their contract is going to be up. So I want you and your little Oberlin bank to be administering this Carnegie trust. And you'll get all this extra money because of that, and the prestige of doing Carnegie business. So of course he jumped at the chance and was loaning her all this money. He lost his entire fortune, which was somewhere around $108,000. And after that, he started going to the bank and he would certify checks for her, which basically meant that if she didn't have money in her account when she presented this check to someone, they would take it out of the bank. And she never had any money in her account because she didn't have any money. So the bank he over the years, he goes through a ton of stress. He keeps thinking he's almost there. She's dangling this trust in front of him and that you're gonna get, like, tens of thousands of dollars at a time very soon, and so he just keep giving her more, until it was just too late, and he just had put too much in to be able to back out and stop doing what he was doing, and his bank eventually went under because he had given her so much money.
I felt so badly for this gentleman, really.
Yeah.
And her downfall begins when she went to Boston, I think. She got a private investor up in Boston. Tell us a little bit about who that was.
As Herbert Newton, he was so originally what happened was that Cassie was trying to expand to get more people to loan her money. As always, she went to the pastor of a really trendy church in Cleveland called Euclid Avenue Baptist Church, and that was where Rockefeller went to church. And she says to him that she is in this community and that she needs to borrow money, but she doesn't know where to turn. She can't let anyone in Cleveland know that she's borrowing money because she's keeping nobody knows that she's borrowing so much money. Um, and so he connects her with this banker in Boston named Herbert Newton. And Newton, she brings her Carnegie notes and her receipt from Reynolds. Um, I don't know that she tells him the story about being Carnegie's bastard daughter at that point, but she is saying, "I have all this money coming to me from Carnegie, um, and I get a trust of I think it's $175,000 twice a year. So whatever you loan me, I'll be able to pay it back within 6 months." So he starts loaning her money, and he ends up loaning her. I think the number is $190,000. It's a lot of money, and he is the one who eventually sues her. No one will sue her before then um, because of the Carnegie thing. No one wants to sue Carnegie's daughter. And she tells everybody how secret Carnegie wants this whole thing and that Carnegie doesn't want anyone to know that she's his daughter. And so suing her in court would definitely ruin that. But
Mhm.
Newton is the first one who does.
Okay. And eventually she does get arrested, if I'm not mistaken, and gets put on trial. Okay.
Yes.
We're not going to tell everybody what goes on in that trial, but I do think there is a meeting, if I'm not mistaken, at least a visual meeting between her and Mr. Carnegie.
Yes. Carnegie very reluctantly came to Cleveland for the trial to be on hand in case they needed to call him as a witness. He did not want to do it, but he did it. And he attended the first morning of trial when they were picking the jury. So he walks into the room and she's already seated at the defense table. And he sits down and everyone's watching both of them. And he's looking at her very obviously, just kind of looking her over. And because she's on trial, she's not, like, watching him, she's just kinda, like, sneaking glances out of the corner of her eye.
Yeah. And even that whole trial, she's putting on an act
Yeah.
because she got so tired putting on an act of being a certain how she walked and how she acted that time. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yes.
Wow. That's amazing.
Um,
Hey, look at this. Friends, this is the cover. The Impostor Heiress. Was this your idea or is this the publishing company's idea? Who thought of this?
we worked together, my editor and I kinda came up with concepts, we knew that we wanted something to cover her eyes or, like, something with
Mhm,
the eyes because she was just
mhm,
such an enigma, you know? But
mhm.
really it was the publishing company, the artist, and I forget his or her name, but they did a fantastic job. I love the cover.
Yeah,
Um,
I know. That people don't realize how important covers are. It's to me, that'll sell a book almost when you see the cover. It's, great stuff. Now, when did this come out? When was this published?
this last June.
Okay, now it's been around 2, 3 months. Are you happy with the way the sales are going?
I don't really know yet. I I don't know. We'll
Haven't gotten
see.
your dividend check yet or your
Haven't
annuity
gotten a
check,
dividend
whatever it
check
is.
yet.
Yeah,
Hopefully that's
okay.
coming. But I'm very happy with the book, so
Yeah. It's in the mail, just like with Cassie. It's coming. Don't worry, I'm
yep,
gonna get it.
fingers crossed.
This is a spectacular book about a fascinating time of our history with an interesting character. You wrote an article in which you mentioned her as one of the 10 greatest, I think, swindlers of the Gilded Age. Where does she come in on your top 10 list?
Oh, she's number 1. In that
Oh, she's
article, I
number one.
believe she's in the middle, but it's not meant to be a countdown, it's just kind of a random list. If
Okay,
it
I was
was a countdown, she'd be number 1.
okay, good. All right. I saw her sort of in the middle. I said, "Gee, wow, if she was this good, imagine what the other ones are like ahead of her." Oh,
No,
so
she was the
so
best.
are we gonna get a movie, TV series, something about this? This is a perfect thing for something for me to watch on Netflix.
I agree, if you know anyone. No, I haven't been approached or anything, but there is a show on HBO called The Gilded Age,
Yes.
um, and it's a fantastic show about the Gilded Age in New York, and I don't wanna spoil anything, but there's definitely a Cassie Chadwick inspired character. I won't say
Oh,
who and when, but it's in there, so
I have that on my queue. I just haven't had a chance to get to it, you know?
yeah.
I'm still stuck on, Kevin Costner's chapter 1 of something called Horizon, in which no one talks for the first 40 minutes. It's a long show, long movie. Ay, ay,
Oh
ay.
boy, this
3
sounds like it.
hours. Yeah, oh my. But, okay. Well, now, what are you researching? What's coming up next for you?
I have to be a little bit coy about it because it's not quite definite yet, but I'm researching another. It's true crime, it's a woman, it's American history, so hopefully I can say something more definite about it in the future, but it's definitely something I'm excited about.
Time-wise, back in the Gilded
Mm,
Age area, up at the Revolutionary Age, any idea when that is?
The 30s, Great Depression.
The 30s, okay.
Yep.
Oh, well, that's a okay. Good. Wow. How long did you research Cassie Chadwick?
It was 4 or 5 years. It was a lot. Well, and I was also unaware of how nonfiction publishing is done, that you know, you don't write the whole book. It was my first time doing this, so I actually did all the research and wrote the whole book and then started approaching agents. Um, and so I think that's not normal. I think you usually do preliminary research, do your proposal, and then see if anyone's interested, and then go back and do the more detailed research.
Alright. Book 2 that you're writing, um,
Mhm.
how long have you been researching book 2?
Few months.
Okay.
Yep.
Alright. And you think that time frame is gonna be condensed, that we're not gonna need 5 years for this one?
I won't need 5 years. I'll need more time. Like, so with nonfiction publishing, you sign your contract and then you have a certain amount of time to deliver the book to the publishers. And so for me, this time I got off on a short time period between contract and delivering the manuscript because I had done all the research and I had a
Mhm.
draft already.
Okay.
This time it would be a longer time period so I can actually do the research.
Mhm. Okay.
So yeah.
But you're interested, you're gonna keep doing this? You're not gonna do any, fiction writing? You're just gonna stick with nonfiction?
Not the plan right now. I do love fiction, and when I started writing, I was writing fiction just for fun, so it's not something that I've never done before, but I just love history, and I just love this narrative nonfiction style is really
Wonderful. Well, I'll tell you what, you did a great job here. The book's called The Impostor Heiress. It is wonderful. You were wonderful. I really appreciate you taking time for us. And I thank you so much for being with us today on Books and Looks.
Thank you, this was a lot of fun.
Again, Annie, thanks so much for spending some time with us. I really enjoyed your book, and your interview was great. I'll tell you what, it's great to meet a young lady, a young new author who's writing nonfiction. You know, that's a great thing, and I'm really, really happy that you're out there and new voice in nonfiction and great stuff. Friends, you're not going to miss this one because I think this is a book that might just make my Christmas wish list. That's coming up sometime early, coming up in November, my Christmas wish list. So I think this one might just be on it. So you want to keep listening for that. What am I looking at? Well, I look at it. Wow. One of our friends of the podcast is coming back. That's right. Our next episode is going to feature none other than my good friend Amy Runyon, who's back with another book. Gosh, that Amy Runyon is prodigious. She is a writer. I'll tell you what, she's going to come back and talk to us all about Mademoiselle Eiffel. That's right, the historical fiction book about Gustave Eiffel's daughter, Claire. Again, this is something you don't want to miss because this is a lady who is sort of lost to history, who was a huge part of her father's business, and she's going to be with us next week to tell us all about Mademoiselle Eiffel. Anyway, on behalf of my website at viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book. So long.